Ruth Callahan stood in the doorway of her modest one-bedroom apartment in Lexington, Kentucky, watching the late afternoon light paint long shadows across her small living room. At 70 years old, with silver-gray hair cut in a simple chin-length bob and warm brown eyes magnified slightly behind wire-rimmed bifocal glasses, she carried the weight of nearly half a century of quiet living. Her navy blue wool cardigan hung loosely over a white cotton blouse, the sleeves worn smooth from decades of turning pages in library archives, handling fragile railroad documents and gently arranging antique memorabilia in museum displays. Her movements were economical, precise, the movements of someone who had learned long ago that purposeful action accomplished more than hurried desperation. She was a woman of discipline and care, someone who treated the past with the reverence it deserved. But lately, she had begun to wonder if that reverence had been misplaced, if her devotion to history had come at the cost of living. Her children seemed to think so. They watched her with the gentle concern reserved for the elderly who are losing their grip on reality. The apartment was neat, almost austere in its simplicity. The furniture was modest, a worn, upholstered sofa facing a television that Ruth rarely watched, a dining table that had belonged to her parents, shelves lined with books on railroad history, labor movements, and Appalachian culture. On the walls hung framed photographs, her wedding day with Walter, now 45 years in the past, their honeymoon trip to Washington, D.C., where they had visited the Smithsonian's railroad collection, Ruth standing in front of the Kentucky Railway Heritage Museum, where she had spent most of her adult life. These photographs were not decorations. They were testimony, evidence that her life had been lived with purpose and intention. 2 years ago, her husband Walter had died. 43 years of marriage ended on a Tuesday morning in a hospital bed. Walter had been a railway engineer, one of the last generation to work the major eastern routes before automation and economics conspired to make his profession nearly obsolete. He had died proud, though, proud of the work he'd done, proud of the historical preservation that Ruth had undertaken, proud that they had found each other in a world that didn't always make room for people who cared about the past. Ruth still slept on her side of the bed. She couldn't bring herself to move into the middle. The weight of his absence occupied that space, and she preferred it that way. Grief, she had learned, was not something to be overcome. It was something to be lived with, carried forward, integrated into the fabric of remaining days. Their daughter Helen and their eldest son Bradley had been circling for months after Walter's funeral, like birds sensing the approach of winter. Bradley especially had taken on the role of executor of Ruth's life with all the warmth of an audit. He'd begun the gentle but insistent campaign. "Mom, you need to think about the future. Assisted living communities are really progressive these days. You could make friends. You wouldn't be alone." Helen echoed the sentiment, though with less conviction. She still called her mother every Sunday, still asked about Ruth's work at the Kentucky Railway Heritage Museum, where Ruth had served as a curator for 28 years before her retirement 3 years prior. Helen's tone, however, had shifted. It was now the careful, slightly anxious tone of someone speaking to an elderly person they suspected might not be thinking clearly. The suggestion underneath both of their concerns was clear. You are a relic, Mother. It's time to be put away carefully. It's time to surrender the pretense that you have a life that still matters. Ruth had discovered early in her career that the past does not surrender its secrets willingly. It requires patience, the kind of patient attention that modern life, with its constant demand for immediate productivity, almost never tolerates. There was meticulous attention to detail required. There was the understanding that history was not simply what had been recorded in official documents or taught in classrooms. It was also what lived in the margins, in sealed compartments, in the memories of ordinary people who had been dismissed as unimportant by those who wrote the official histories. For 40 years, Ruth had devoted herself to recovering those stories. She had interviewed hundreds of railroad workers, their widows, their children. She had acquired dozens of artifacts, carefully preserved them, and displayed them with reverence in the museum. She had published 3 monographs on the railroad history of the Appalachian region, detailed scholarly works that had received modest recognition in academic circles, but which her own children had treated as evidence of her peculiarity. Not one of her children had ever read them. Bradley had actually joked about it at a family dinner years ago. "My mother writes books. Nobody reads about trains. Nobody remembers." Everyone had laughed. Ruth had said nothing. 6 months after Walter died, Ruth had attended an estate auction in Harlan County, Kentucky, about 100 miles southeast of Lexington, in the heart of coal country. She'd gone partly out of professional curiosity, partly out of a need to be among the remnants of the past, where she felt most understood and most alive. A family was liquidating the property of a great-aunt, the aunt's modest house, her furniture, her accumulated possessions, the detritus of a life that was being dispersed to the highest bidders. Mixed in with the household items were old railroad memorabilia, and Ruth's trained eye had caught them immediately. A collection of vintage station signs, some authentic Louisville and Nashville Railroad timetables from the 1930s, a beautiful brass conductor's pocket watch that still kept reasonably accurate time. Ruth had bid on these items and won them, paying more than they might have fetched from collectors less knowledgeable, but she understood that preservation came with a cost. It was during the auction preview, walking the grounds of the estate, that Ruth had first seen the depot. She had been walking away from the house, toward the tree line, when she'd looked back and noticed it. A structure visible across an overgrown expanse of abandoned track, partially obscured by the gathering dusk and the thick vegetation that had begun to reclaim the landscape. It stood about a quarter-mile away, visible across an overgrown expanse of abandoned track. The building was a 1920s red brick structure, 2 stories, with weathered green trim peeling from the eaves like old paint left in the sun too long. The windows were boarded. The platform was sagging, overgrown with ironweed and tall grass that rustled in the March breeze. Rusted baggage carts lay half-sunk in the earth beside the foundation, their iron frames still strong, but their wooden slatted beds rotted through and collapsed, slowly returning to the earth from which the wood had originally come. The roof showed places where slates had fallen away, and vines, kudzu mostly, that unstoppable southern vine that had become a metaphor for the South's inability to escape its past, had begun their work of consumption, the way they always did in abandoned places. The building was a monument to time, to the way the human world was gradually reclaimed by the natural world if given the chance. Ruth had felt something move in her chest. It was recognition, though of what, she wasn't quite sure. It was as if the building was calling to her across the distance, as if something dormant in her genetic memory was awakening in response to its presence. She had stood for 10 minutes, maybe more, simply looking at it, feeling the weight of its abandonment, sensing something significant in that dereliction. She'd asked one of the auction house representatives about the depot. The woman had shrugged, clearly uninterested in a building that was not part of the liquidation. "It's on the same property, but I don't think it's in the liquidation. Building's been condemned for years. They'll probably tear it down eventually, or it'll just fall down on its own." Ruth had pressed further and learned that the depot, technically, was listed in the county records as owned by the estate, though the great-aunt had apparently had no interest in it. Her husband had purchased it decades ago as a romantic gesture toward his own father's memory, some gesture of family piety, and it had sat sealed ever since. The great-aunt's children wanted nothing to do with it. It was a liability, not an asset. It was a structure that generated no income and required attention that the heirs were unwilling to provide. The auction house had finally told her, if she wanted it, they'd sell it to her for $800, just to clear the title and move the problem off their books. $800 to claim ownership of a condemned building, to take on the liability, to become responsible for a structure that nobody else wanted. Ruth had not hesitated. She'd made her offer that very afternoon, paying in cash, receiving the deed, becoming the owner of something that everyone else had deemed worthless. When she'd told Bradley and Helen about the purchase 2 weeks later, there had been a long silence on the phone line. Bradley spoke first, his voice taking on that particular tone of patient condescension that he reserved for elderly people and people he deemed financially naive, a tone that had become habitual for him, a default setting in his relationships with anyone he considered less sophisticated than himself. "Mom, I'm just trying to understand the financial logic here. You're telling me you spent $800 on a building that the county has condemned, a building you cannot legally live in or lease out, a structure that will deteriorate further and probably cost you thousands to maintain or demolish?" Helen had made a soft noise of distress in the background. "Mom, that's not like you. Are you okay? Did you talk to your doctor about this? Sometimes after a spouse dies, people make uncharacteristic decisions. It's a documented psychological phenomenon." Ruth had explained calmly that it was her money, her savings, accumulated over a lifetime of modest living and careful stewardship. Her home was paid for. She had no debts. Her pension from the museum was sufficient for her needs. She was 70 years old, a widow, and nobody else had claim to her choices. If she wanted to spend $800 on a condemned train depot in Kentucky, that was her prerogative. "It's a tax write-off," Bradley had said flatly, as if this was obvious. "At best. Mom, you're throwing money away. You're grieving, and you're not thinking clearly. Have you considered talking to someone, a therapist? There are grief counselors. There are medications that can help. I could look into senior mental health programs if you'd like." Ruth had quietly hung up the phone. Not in anger, but in a kind of resigned sadness. She had learned long ago that Bradley did not have the capacity to understand anything that did not fit into his framework of rational self-interest and material accumulation. Trying to explain her choice to him would be like trying to explain color to someone who had never seen. Helen had called back an hour later, her voice careful and loving. "Mom, we're worried about you, that's all. We just want you to be okay." But underneath Helen's concern was the same fundamental premise. Ruth was no longer responsible for understanding her own life. The children would do that now. The children would make the decisions. The children would determine what was reasonable and what was not. It was an infantilization that was done with love, which made it somehow more painful. It took Ruth another month to gather the courage to drive to Harlan County and actually look at what she'd purchased, to stand alone in an abandoned building and ask herself whether she had, in fact, lost her mind. On a gray morning in March, she'd packed her brown leather suitcase, a piece of luggage that had belonged to her grandfather Samuel and that she'd inherited through her father's will, with a change of clothes, a flashlight, a notebook for jotting observations, and a thermos of tea. The suitcase was medium-sized, with brass clasps, that had dulled with age to a soft gold color, and it contained the weight of family history in the very fact of its existence. Her grandfather had carried this suitcase when he traveled for the railroad. Her father had carried it. Now Ruth carried it, a physical object that connected her to the past, that made the past tangible and real, rather than merely theoretical or nostalgic. The drive took 3 hours, winding through the Cumberland Plateau. Ruth drove her modest sedan at a steady pace, not hurrying, taking in the landscape as it transformed from the gentler rolling terrain around Lexington into the deeper, more austere hills of eastern Kentucky. The hills here were older, worn down by time and mining. The vegetation was thick and chaotic, the kudzu growing so rampantly that it had entirely swallowed entire hillsides, making them look like green phantoms of themselves, like nature's way of covering up the scars that humans had made. Abandoned coal company houses dotted the landscape, their windows empty eyes staring out at a way of life that had moved on without them, leaving behind only the architecture of obsolescence. Some houses were still inhabited, their yards marked with signs of effort, gardens, clotheslines, evidence of people trying to maintain dignity in a place the world had largely forgotten. Ruth had studied this landscape her whole professional life. She had read the county histories, the oral histories, the government records. She had walked these roads in the 1980s, interviewing retired railroad workers, listening to stories about the routes that the Louisville and Nashville Railroad had run through these mountains, carrying coal to the north, bringing supplies back south. The conversations had been intense, emotional. Old men had told her stories that nobody else cared about, stories about dangerous working conditions, about injuries that had never been properly reported, about the solidarity that workers had developed with each other, about the ways that management had tried to break that solidarity through intimidation and manipulation. Ruth had documented these stories. She had preserved them. Those workers were almost all dead now. Their stories lived only in archives and in the minds of people like Ruth, who had deemed them worth preserving when the world had deemed them insignificant. She arrived at the depot around 2 in the afternoon. The property was accessible from a rough dirt road that veered off the main highway, a road that was barely maintained and that seemed to be slowly being reclaimed by the vegetation on either side. She parked at the end of the road, in what had once been a small gravel lot, now mostly weeds pushing through the decomposing asphalt. She sat for a moment in the car, hands on the steering wheel, looking at the structure that was now, technically, hers. She was nervous. She was 70 years old, alone in a condemned building in rural Kentucky, and her children would have called this exactly the kind of reckless behavior that proved she was losing her mental faculties. Ruth didn't care. She was following a thread, and she was going to see where it led. It was exactly as she remembered it, desolate, weathered, magnificent in its decay. The red brick had faded to a dull, burnt orange. The green trim was more gray than green now, the paint cracked and peeling. One of the boarded windows on the upper story had partly come loose, showing darkness within. The platform was absolutely overrun with vegetation, ironweed, tall grasses, weeds of kinds Ruth couldn't immediately identify, all of them growing in the spaces where human civilization had ended. The baggage carts were the most poignant detail. 2 of them, their iron frames still solid and structurally sound. Their wooden slatted beds rotted through and collapsed, slowly returning to the earth. There was poetry in their decay, Ruth thought. There was a kind of mercy in being allowed to return to the elements. Ruth got out of the car slowly, leaving her brown leather suitcase on the passenger seat for now. She would need that suitcase for the journey she was about to take. the interior journey into family history. But first, she needed to see with her own eyes what she had purchased. She needed to understand whether her instinct had been correct or whether she had, as her children feared, succumbed to some form of grief-induced magical thinking. The grass was tall enough that it brushed her dark gray slacks as she walked toward the depot. The ground was soft beneath her sturdy brown leather walking shoes, slightly marshy in places where the winter moisture had not fully drained. It was early March, and the Kentucky winter was reluctant to release its grip. The air was cool, damp, carrying the mineral smell of coal dust and damp earth that permeated the entire region, a smell that had become characteristic of the place, that marked it as fundamentally different from anywhere else Ruth had lived. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear wind moving through the kudzu-covered hills, a sound like the earth sighing, like the land expressing some ancient melancholy about what had been done to it. The platform itself was treacherous. Several of the wooden boards were split and warped, and Ruth had to move carefully, testing each step before committing her weight. At her age, a fall could be catastrophic. She was acutely aware of the fragility of her body, the ways that age made one vulnerable to injury. But she was also aware that the alternative, playing it safe, avoiding risk, staying home and accepting the slow diminishment that her children assume was her future, was unacceptable. So she moved carefully, but she moved forward. The door to the main waiting room was not boarded. Ruth had the legal papers that indicated she owned it, and her ownership included the legal right to enter, and it swung open with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for her. The interior was a study in abandonment. Dust lay thick on everything, creating a texture like age itself, like time made visible. The wooden flooring was stained and cracked, with dark spots where water had penetrated over the decades. The walls still bore the faint outline of where posters and schedules had hung. You could see the slightly less faded outlines where they had protected the wall paint from the slow bleaching of sunlight. There was a cracked ticket counter, its brass fixtures dulled by years of neglect. A single window, broken and boarded, let in thin lines of light that illuminated dust motes floating in the stale air, small particles of the past, suspended in light. And then there was the door to the back office. It was warped oak, painted a dark brown that had faded to almost gray. It was fitted with a heavy brass lock that looked like it had been engaged for decades, a lock that had likely not been opened since the day the railroad had abandoned this depot. Ruth approached it slowly, her heart beating faster. This was the sealed room. This was the space that had been locked for 70 years, since the day the railroad had abandoned this depot and left it to time. This was the space where history lived, if it lived anywhere at all. The lock was rusted through, though, and the door itself had warped enough over the decades that when Ruth pushed on it, it moved. The lock was no barrier anymore. The wood itself was the barrier, and it was weak from years of moisture and settling. She pushed harder. The door groaned, resisted, and then gave way with a sound like a complaint. The hinges shrieked. Dust exploded from the space between the frame and the door. Ruth coughed, stepped back, and waited for the air to settle. She could see nothing but the cloud of particulate time, all the years that had accumulated in this sealed space, finally being released. When it did, she stepped through into the station master's office. It was smaller than she expected, perhaps 12 feet by 10 feet, with one window that was boarded shut. The walls were a dull cream color, water-stained and faded. Behind what had once been a substantial oak desk, now sagging and warped with water damage, she could see the north wall. There was an old schedule board still mounted there, its glass front so dusty that the train schedule beneath was illegible, but something else caught her eye. a looseness in the wall, near the baseboard, where years of settling and moisture had warped the wooden paneling. Ruth moved slowly, carefully. Her grandfather Samuel's letter was like a key in her memory now, a key that had been locked away until recently. She had read those letters 100 times, maybe more, after she'd found them in her father's effects. Samuel Callahan had been her grandfather, her father's father. He had worked as a station master for the Louisville and Nashville Railroad for 40 years. He had retired in 1945, and then, the following year, had died. Ruth had been only 5 years old, too young to remember him in person, knowing him only through the stories her father had told and the letters, oh, the letters, that her father had kept in a box in the attic. The letter that had lain dormant in her memory for 60 years, until just recently. She'd been sorting through some of her father's old papers, looking for something else entirely, when she'd found them tied together with twine. 24 letters written by Samuel to his wife Margaret during his service in the Second World War. Samuel had worked in something called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. The letters were cryptic, deliberately vague, the way correspondence from sensitive military posts had to be. But there was one letter, dated June 1946, 3 months before his death, that contained a line that had leaped out at Ruth as if it had been written in that very moment. The station keeps what the family cannot. Behind the master's desk, the north wall remembers. She had read it 100 times and thought it poetry. She had been moved by its beauty, its metaphorical power. Now, standing in an abandoned station master's office, 76 years later, she wondered if it might be something else entirely. Ruth ran her weathered fingers along the paneling near the baseboard. The wood was soft in places, compromised by time and moisture. She pressed, and a small section gave way. She pushed harder, more deliberately, and a wooden panel about 18 inches square came loose. Dust and cobwebs cascaded down. Ruth coughed, shielded her eyes, and waited. Her hands were trembling. She was 70 years old, and her hands were trembling like a young woman's. When the air cleared, she leaned down and peered into the hollow space she had created. There was something in there, something wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, darkened with age but still intact. An iron lockbox, perhaps 8 inches square, preserved by the protective wrapping and by the dry interior of the sealed wall. Behind it, she could make out the shape of more papers, also wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine that had turned gray with time. Letters, most likely. Samuel's unsent letters, or copies of them, preserved in this hidden cavity for over 70 years, waiting for the descendant who would understand their significance. Ruth's hands trembled as she reached in and carefully withdrew the lockbox. It was heavier than she expected, and the brass catch was stiff with age. Next to it, she discovered a bundle of papers, also wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine that had turned gray with time. She withdrew these items carefully, one at a time, and laid them gently on the least damaged section of the desk. Then she went back to her car to retrieve her brown leather suitcase. The suitcase that had belonged to her grandfather. The suitcase that contained, somehow, a part of her family's narrative that she was only now beginning to understand. It took Ruth an hour to carefully open the lockbox. The catch was frozen, and she had to work it gently, coaxing it with patience and the application of a small amount of penetrating oil that she'd wisely brought in her suitcase. When it finally gave way and she lifted the lid, she found herself staring at layers of time itself. On top lay a handwritten ledger, bound in green leather, its pages thick with Samuel Callahan's careful script. The entries were dated from 1923 to 1946. As Ruth carefully turned the pages, her eyes moving across the faded handwriting, she began to understand what her grandfather had preserved. A complete record of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad Trust Fund, established by the railroad company in 1923 to safeguard the pensions and death benefits of its workers and their families. Beneath the ledger lay the original bonds, dozens of them, ornate certificates printed on heavy paper, bearing the signatures of railroad officials from 8 decades ago. They were railway bonds from 1923, each worth several $1,000s in 1923 currency, and worth, Ruth calculated with growing shock, several $100,000s in modern valuation. But that wasn't even the most remarkable discovery. Beneath the bonds lay a second document, a deed or contract of sorts, written in Samuel's hand. It was dated March 1946 and read, "This trust and these certificates are established for the first Callahan who shall remember what family is. The railroads built this nation. The workers who ran them deserve remembrance. I leave this responsibility and this inheritance to whichever of my descendants keeps alive the stories that powerful men wish forgotten." Ruth had to sit down. There was a warped wooden chair in the corner of the office, and she sank into it, the bundle of her grandfather's letters in her lap, her hands shaking. Samuel had known. He had known that his descendants would not value what he had valued. He had known that the railroad industry would decline, that the workers would be forgotten, that his own legacy would mean nothing to his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who were busy becoming accountants and corporate middle managers. So he had created a test, a puzzle, a challenge hidden in a sealed room in a condemned building. And he had waited, trusting that somewhere in the long descent of his family, there would be someone who cared enough about the past to solve it. Ruth carefully opened the bundle of letters. They were written in the same careful hand as the ledger entries, addressed to his wife, Margaret, and they told a story of a man serving his country in ways that the official history had never recorded. Samuel had been an OSS agent, protecting Union funds and coordinating with labor organizers during the war. He had seen corruption at the highest levels of government and industry. He had learned that money and power were the levers that moved the world, and that ordinary people were left to suffer the consequences of decisions made in distant boardrooms. But in his letters, he wrote with profound love for his wife, for his family, and for the idea that history, real history, the history of ordinary workers and their struggles, deserved to be preserved and honored. Ruth sat in that sealed office as the afternoon light shifted, moving through the boarded window's cracks, and she wept. She wept for her grandfather, whom she barely remembered. She wept for her father, who had kept these letters but never explained them, perhaps because he himself had doubted their significance. She wept for her own lifetime of work, all the hours she had spent in archives and museums, all the people she had interviewed, all the stories she had preserved, while her own children rolled their eyes at her obsession with the past. She wept because Samuel's trust was also a judgment. He had left his inheritance not to the most successful or the most ambitious. He had left it to the one person in the family who had cared enough about memory to keep it alive. As darkness began to fall, Ruth carefully repacked the lockbox and the letters into her brown leather suitcase, along with the ledger and Samuel's handwritten trust document. She would take these to a lawyer. She would have them authenticated. She would learn what they actually meant in legal and financial terms. but she already knew what they meant in the terms that mattered to her. She was not foolish. She was not throwing her life away. She was answering a call that her grandfather had issued 76 years ago, across the distance of his death, trusting that someone in his family line would understand. The following week, Ruth met with an estate lawyer in Lexington, a woman named Patricia Morrison, who specialized in antique valuations and historical property. Ruth brought the lockbox, the letters, the ledger, and the bonds. Ms. Morrison examined everything with professional care, photographing each document, cross-referencing the railroad certificates with historical records, and gradually building a picture of what Samuel Callahan had preserved. "These bonds are genuine," Ms. Morrison said, her voice careful and precise. "They're issued by the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, and they never entered into default. When the railroad finally restructured in the 1980s, these bonds were grandfathered in as valid securities. In today's market, they're worth approximately $3.2 million. Ruth's hands went numb. Bradley Callahan called 3 days later. Ruth's lawyer had apparently sent him a notification of the trust claim. The phone call came on a Wednesday evening, just as Ruth was finishing her dinner, a simple meal of soup and bread, the kind of modest supper that had sustained her through years of living independently. His voice, when Ruth answered the phone, was tight with controlled fury, barely restrained. "Mom, what in the name of God is happening here? Why is a lawyer calling me about some supposed trust fund? Why are you dragging the family through this?" He spoke the words quickly, as if speed would somehow make them more convincing or more forceful. The woman said something about millions of dollars. "This is insane. This is absolutely insane. Do you understand how this looks? How it looks to people? People are going to think you've lost your mind. People are going to ask if you're competent to manage your own affairs." Ruth had listened to his voice without interrupting. She had heard Bradley speak this way before, the controlled fury of someone who believed himself to be the reasonable adult surrounded by unreasonable people. She waited until he had exhausted his immediate arguments, and then she began to speak, calmly and clearly, about what she had found in the sealed office of the train depot. She described the lockbox, the bonds, the handwritten ledger, the letters from Samuel. She did not editorialize. She did not try to convince him of anything. She simply laid out the facts with the precision of a woman trained in historical documentation. Bradley interrupted her several times. "Mom, this is a fantasy. Do you understand that? This is a fantasy that you've constructed. You've convinced yourself that this sealed office exists, that there are bonds hidden in the walls, that your grandfather left you a trust. But none of this is real. It's not how reality works. It's not how inheritance works. It's not how anything works. You've created an entire narrative to justify throwing your money away on that condemned building. You're grieving. You're not thinking clearly." Ruth let him finish. Then she said, quietly, but with absolute certainty, "Your grandfather left this to me. Not to you, Bradley. Not to Helen. To me. Because I was the one who cared about preserving the family's history. He wanted me to know that the work I did was valuable. He wanted me to know that I was right." There was a quality in her voice that had never been there before. Not anger, but a kind of final certainty, as if she had finally claimed something that had always belonged to her. There had been a long silence on the other end of the phone line. Then Bradley had said, his voice changing, becoming almost pleading, "Mom, you need to get a psychological evaluation. This is clearly a fantasy. I'm going to speak to Helen about this. We may need to petition the court for a conservatorship. For your own protection, we need to get you evaluated by a doctor who can confirm whether you're competent to make your own decisions. This is for your own good. You understand that, right? We're doing this because we love you." Ruth had hung up the phone, not in anger, but in a kind of sad finality. The conversation was over. It had been over before it began. She sat at her dining table, in the quiet of her small apartment, and ate the rest of her soup. It was still warm. The bread was still good. Outside her window, the evening traffic moved along the street below. The world continued. It would continue. This time, Helen did not call back. The legal process for validating the trust took 6 months, exactly as Ms. Morrison had predicted. It was a process that consumed Ruth's time and emotional energy in ways that surprised her. She had to meet with lawyers. She had to provide documentation of her work history. The museum had to provide records of her employment and her accomplishments. Her published works had to be retrieved and presented to the court as evidence of her scholarly engagement with railroad history. Ms. Morrison was thorough, meticulous, building a case not just for the validity of Samuel's trust, but for Ruth herself, for her competence, her integrity, her lifetime of commitment to preserving historical truth. Bradley hired a lawyer to contest the claim, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who was known for his aggressive defense of family interests. Whitmore argued that Samuel Callahan had not intended for the bonds to be inherited by a specific descendant, that the trust document was not a legal instrument, but merely a personal note written by an elderly man in declining health, and that Ruth had essentially perpetrated a theft, removing assets that should have been divided equally among all of Samuel's descendants, including Bradley and Helen. He called expert witnesses who testified about the deteriorating mental state of aging individuals, about the susceptibility of the elderly to false memories and magical thinking. He cast doubt on Ruth's credibility, on her interpretation of her grandfather's intentions, on her entire history of work with railroad memorabilia. The judge's name was Margaret Chen, and she was 62 years old, the daughter of immigrants, a woman who had made her own way in the world and who understood something about the relationship between memory and identity. She read Samuel's handwritten document carefully. She reviewed the evidence of Ruth's professional accomplishments. She listened to testimony from museum directors and historians who spoke about Ruth's contributions to the field. And then, after 3 days of legal arguments, she issued her ruling. The evidence before this court establishes beyond reasonable doubt, Judge Chen said, her voice clear and measured, that the decedent Samuel Callahan deliberately established a trust fund to be inherited by a specific descendant, the descendant who would preserve the family's historical legacy. The evidence further establishes that Ruth Callahan has spent her entire professional career preserving railroad history and the stories of railroad workers. She has published scholarly works. She has served as a museum curator for nearly 3 decades. She has devoted her life to the exact work that her grandfather described in his trust document. The handwritten document, while unusual in form, satisfies the requirements for a valid testamentary instrument. This court finds that the trust is valid and binding. The bonds, the ledger, and the trust fund are the property of Ruth Callahan. The trust was hers. The bonds were hers. The inheritance was real. $3.2 million. More money than Ruth had ever imagined possessing. More money than she wanted, to be honest. She had never aspired to wealth. She had aspired to understanding. She had aspired to the preservation of meaningful things in a world determined to forget them. Bradley did not speak to her for a year after the court ruling. Ruth had expected this. She understood her son well enough to know that he could not afford, emotionally, to acknowledge the judgment against him. To speak to Ruth would be to admit defeat. To see her would be to confront the reality that he had been wrong. Not just about the trust, but about his mother, about his understanding of who she was and what she was capable of understanding. So he remained silent. He ignored her calls. He did not respond to her letters. Ruth did not push. She had spent her life understanding that people reveal themselves through their silences as much as through their words. Helen called tentatively, about 6 weeks after the ruling. Her voice was careful, uncertain. "Mom, I saw the news about the court decision. Congratulations, I guess. I mean, I'm happy for you, I think." There was an awkward pause. Helen was trying to navigate between her love for her mother and her loyalty to her brother, trying to find some position that would not require her to choose. "I wanted to talk to you about maybe coming to visit. Would that be okay? I want to see what you're planning to do with the depot. I want to understand." Ruth had felt something soften in her chest. "Of course you can visit, Helen. I would very much like to show you what I'm planning. I think you might understand it better than you think." Helen had come the following weekend, driving down from Cincinnati where she lived with her husband and 2 children. Ruth had shown her the depot, the sealed office, the spaces where the lockbox had been hidden. Helen had looked at everything with an expression that was part wonder, part regret. Before leaving, Helen had said, "I'm sorry I doubted you, Mom. I should have known you better." Ruth had hugged her daughter and said, "You were worried about me. That comes from love. I understand that. It would take Bradley longer to come around, much longer." But Ruth did not wait for him. She had spent too much of her life waiting for other people's approval. In the months following the court ruling, Ruth worked with contractors and architects to develop a plan for the restoration of the depot. She was 71 years old, and yet she found herself energized by a sense of purpose, unlike anything she had felt since Walter's death. She made trips to Harlan County, staying in a small motel, spending hours on the property, planning how each space would be used, how the history would be told. She consulted with historians and museum professionals. She interviewed local people who remembered the depot when it was still in use, recording their stories, incorporating their memories into the archival record. The restoration took 18 months. It was meticulous work, done with respect for the original construction. The red brick was carefully cleaned. Damaged stones were replaced with matching brick, sourced from a salvage operation 2 counties over. The weathered green trim was carefully restored to its original color, a shade that Ruth had researched in historical photographs and paint samples. The windows were replaced with glass that matched the original specifications, creating views into the restored interior that honored what the depot had been. The platform was rebuilt using techniques and materials that would have been familiar to the original builders. The track was not reactivated. Ruth had no need for functioning rails, but it was cleaned and partially restored, creating a sense of the depot's original purpose. Inside, Ruth worked with a local contractor to stabilize the structure, address water damage, and create climate-controlled spaces for the museum. The station master's office became a small archival room where the original documents, the bonds, the ledger, Samuel's letters, were carefully preserved in archival cases and displayed behind museum-quality glass. The walls were painted a warm cream, and the lighting was designed to honor the historical documents without causing damage from light exposure. The rest of the main waiting room was converted into exhibition space, where Ruth curated displays about the railroad's history in eastern Kentucky, the workers who had built and maintained the lines, the role of the railroad in the region's economic life. Ruth established the depot as a nonprofit museum, registering it with the state of Kentucky as a public historical institution. She hired a local historian named Dr. James Morrison as director, a man who had grown up in Harlan County, whose grandfather had worked as a railroad engineer, who understood the significance of what Ruth was trying to accomplish. She hired 2 part-time staff members, both from the local community, both passionate about preserving the history of their region. The museum opened to the public 18 months after Ruth's discovery, with a ceremony attended by local officials, historians, journalists, and residents. The story of the sealed office, the hidden bonds, the trust fund, all of it had become local legend. Ruth was no longer seen as a foolish elderly widow who had wasted her money on a condemned building. She was seen as a woman who had understood something that nobody else could see, who had had the courage to follow that understanding, and who had been vindicated. The museum was open 3 days a week, Wednesday through Friday, and regularly hosted school groups from the surrounding counties. Children came to learn about the people who had built the rails that their ancestors had traveled. They saw photographs of workers in hard hats and work clothes. They read names in the archival records, names of men and women whose labor had been essential to building the nation's transportation infrastructure. Workers came to find their family names in the records and to know that their labor had been recognized as valuable, that their stories had been deemed worthy of preservation. Ruth spent most of her time at the depot now. She had reduced her apartment in Lexington to storage space, keeping it as a base but spending 5 days a week in Harlan County, working with the museum director, expanding the collections, adding to the archival records. She had rented a small cottage just a mile from the depot, a modest 3-room house that had belonged to a retired teacher, with a front porch where Ruth could sit in the mornings and watch the mist rise off the hills. She had furnished it simply, a narrow bed, a small desk for her work, shelves for her research materials, a kitchen where she could prepare the simple meals that satisfied her. She was 72 years old when the museum opened. She had what many people would consider a comfortable retirement, $3.2 million in the bank, a stable income from her carefully managed investments, the respect of the historical community. But she had never been interested in comfort. She had always been interested in meaning. She had spent her life understanding that comfort was often the enemy of understanding, that ease could prevent the deep engagement with difficult truths that preservation required. Her mornings at the cottage followed a ritual. She would rise early, before dawn, and make coffee on an old stovetop. She would sit on the porch with her cup, watching the darkness gradually give way to gray, then, to the first hints of gold. She would think about the work of the day ahead, new documents to catalog, visitors to the museum to welcome, research to expand the archival records. As the sun rose fully over the hills, she would feel a sense of gratitude that surprised her. She had spent so much of her life feeling dismissed, undervalued, peripheral to the concerns of her own family. But here, in this small cottage in Harlan County, doing the work that she had always been meant to do, she felt centered. She felt that her life had meaning. The museum attracted visitors from across the region and, increasingly, from farther afield. Historians came to study the documents, requesting copies of the bond certificates and the ledger for their own research. Students came for research projects on Appalachian labor history and the role of railroads in the region's economic development. Journalists came to do stories about the remarkable discovery, about the woman who had solved a 70-year-old mystery hidden in the walls of a condemned building. Magazine articles were published. Ruth was interviewed on local radio stations. A documentary filmmaker spent 3 weeks filming at the depot, recording Ruth as she explained the significance of each artifact, as she talked about her grandfather Samuel, and the trust he had created across the decades. But most importantly, the local people came, the descendants of the workers whose names were recorded in Samuel's ledger, the people for whom this history was not abstract but personal, connected to their own family stories. Ruth would stand in the archival room, watching an elderly man trace his grandfather's name in the records, his weathered fingers moving across the page with reverence. She would watch the expression on his face change as he understood that his ancestors' work had been recognized and preserved, that the man he had only known through his father's vague stories had actually existed, had actually accomplished something worth remembering. She would watch a woman in her 60s realize that her great-uncle's death in a railroad accident, which had devastated the family, had been recorded in the archival records alongside a notation about the workers' compensation that had been established to protect families in just such circumstances. Ruth would see the tears form in these people's eyes, and she would understand, finally and completely, why she had devoted her life to this work. Those moments made the entire journey worthwhile. Those moments validated every hour she had spent researching, cataloging, preserving, remembering. 18 months after the museum opened its doors, on a golden afternoon in late September, Ruth received a phone call that made her hands go cold. It was Helen, calling from Cincinnati. "Mom, you should know that Bradley is coming to Harlan County. He's driving down tomorrow. He wants to see the depot. He wants to talk to you." Ruth's immediate reaction was fear. Not physical fear, but the fear of confrontation, of having to defend herself and her choices again. But beneath that fear was something else, a faint hope that maybe finally her son was ready to understand. Bradley arrived on a gray Saturday morning. Ruth was at the depot working with Dr. Morrison on cataloging some newly acquired documents. When Bradley walked into the main waiting room, Ruth's first instinct was to stand up, to present herself as ready for whatever confrontation he had prepared. But when she saw his face, she understood that this was not an adversary come for battle. His face was older than she remembered, more lined, as if the past 18 months had aged him. He was holding a manila folder in his hands, and his eyes were red. "Mom," he said, his voice quiet and controlled, but with none of the condescension she had come to expect from him. "I owe you an apology. I've owed you one for a long time." Ruth felt something give way in her chest. She did not speak. She let him continue. "I came here to see this for myself, to see what you've done. And I've spent the last hour looking at the museum, reading the documents, listening to Dr. Morrison talk about your work." He paused, struggling with something. "I was wrong. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about the trust. I was wrong about thinking you were losing your mind. I was protecting myself. I was defending my idea of what you should be, instead of trying to understand what you actually are." Ruth did not know what to say. She did not know how to accept an apology from her son that came after so much pain and estrangement. She simply nodded, and then she reached out and hugged him. He held her, and she could feel him shaking. "I brought something," Bradley said, pulling back and opening the manila folder. Inside were copies of Ruth's 3 published monographs on railroad history. "I read them, all 3 of them. I read them over the past 2 weeks. And they're good, Mom. They're really good. They're scholarly and careful, and they tell stories that matter. I don't know why it took me so long to understand that your work was valuable, but I understand it now." Ruth took the books from him, feeling the weight of them in her hands. "Thank you, Bradley. That means more than you can know." She did not tell him that it was too late, that the damage had been done, that she had already learned to live without his approval. Instead, she said, "Would you like to have dinner with me tonight? There's a good restaurant in town. I'd like to tell you about some of the work we're planning to do at the museum." On this golden afternoon, as Ruth walked alone on the restored platform of the Harlan County train depot, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this place. The kudzu-covered hills beyond the property were softening in the slanting light, and the sky was turning the colors of sunset, amber and gold and rose. Ruth stood at the platform's edge, her brown leather suitcase beside her. She had kept it with her, a reminder of the journey she had undertaken, of the discovery that had transformed her life, of the trust that had validated decades of work that nobody else had seemed to value. Her silver-gray hair caught the sunlight. Her wire-rimmed glasses reflected the golden rays. She wore her navy blue wool cardigan against the evening chill. She was thinking about her grandfather, Samuel, about the careful planning that had gone into preserving this treasure. She was thinking about the letter he had written to her father, the cryptic line about the station keeping what the family could not. She was thinking about the chain of understanding that had passed from Samuel to her father to her, connecting across decades and distances, across generations, linking the living to the dead through the power of memory. She was thinking about all the people in the world whose stories deserved to be preserved, whose labor deserved to be honored, whose existence deserved to be remembered as important and meaningful. She was thinking about her husband, Walter, who had died before seeing her vindication. She wondered if somehow, in whatever comes after, he knew that she had been right. She thought about the workers whose names were now recorded in the museum's archives, workers whose grandchildren and great-grandchildren would come to the depot and see their ancestors' names and know that those ancestors' lives had mattered. She was thinking about Bradley's visit, about the reconciliation that was not quite complete, but was real nonetheless. She had established a generous scholarship fund at the university, creating opportunities for young people from the region to attend college. Bradley's request for help with his daughter's college expenses had become an entry point for a different kind of conversation between them. Ruth did not expect that Bradley would ever fully understand why she had done what she had done. But she no longer needed him to understand. She had learned that validation could come from unexpected sources, from the judge who had ruled in her favor, from the historians and museum professionals who had recognized her contributions, from the children who came to the museum and learned about the workers who had built the railroad. The restored depot stood behind her, its windows glowing softly in the fading light. Inside, the museum held the physical evidence of her grandfather's wisdom and her own lifetime of commitment to remembrance. Inside those walls were the bonds, the ledger, the letters, the physical artifacts that proved that Samuel had understood something that nobody else had grasped. He had understood that memory was a form of power. He had understood that preserving the lives and stories of ordinary people against the indifference of history was a sacred responsibility. He had trusted that somewhere in the long descent of his family, there would be someone who shared that understanding. But Ruth's real inheritance was not the money or the building or the historical documents. It was the knowledge that she had been right, that her work had been important, that decades of quiet, meticulous labor had had meaning, that the past was not something to be discarded and moved away from, but something to be cherished and preserved and celebrated. It was the knowledge that memory, when it is truly valued, can transform a life. It can validate decades of quiet work. It can reach back through time and connect the living to the dead in ways that are real and measurable and true. It can prove that a life lived in service to preservation and remembrance is a life well lived. She picked up her brown leather suitcase, feeling its familiar weight, the weight of family history, of inherited purpose, of a responsibility that had finally been claimed and honored. She turned to look back at the depot one more time. The sky above the hills was turning orange, then pink, then purple. The light would fade soon. She would return to the small cottage she had rented in Harlan County, where she now lived most of the time, spending her mornings at the museum and her evenings reading, always reading, adding to the archival collection, expanding the exhibition, deepening the story of the workers who had built this nation. Ruth Callahan, 72 years old now, widow, museum curator, the keeper of her family's secrets and her grandfather's trust, walked back down the platform as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Her footsteps sounded on the restored wooden boards, each step a kind of affirmation, each step an answer to the question that had haunted her for so long. Am I doing something that matters? Behind her, the train depot stood restored and purposeful, no longer abandoned but alive with the stories of the workers who had built the nation, one railroad tie at a time. The building had been given a second life through Ruth's dedication and her willingness to follow where history was calling. Samuel's vision had finally been fulfilled. His family, in the person of his granddaughter Ruth, had remembered. And in remembering, she had honored not just the past, but the sacred responsibility that each generation bears to preserve the truth of what came before.